As folks are coming into the room, welcome. We're just going to give it 2 or 3 minutes before we hand it over to our esteemed speaker. We'll also be going live on Facebook in about 2 minutes. So again, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. All right, I think we are ready to go. So my name is M. McDonough. I am Outreach Coordinator for the Piper Center for Creative Writing at Arizona State University. I work with community partners to build creative writing programming throughout the Phoenix community. Joined by my colleague, Joy Young. Joy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, apologies if there's a dog or landscaping noises. My home is apparently a very loud place today. I'm the coordinator for educational programs at the Piper Center. I'll be with you tomorrow if you're also in the course that is an extension of this. That's a little bit more intimate. And I'm just really excited to be here on what is a challenging day.
I would like to start this with a land acknowledgement from the Virginia G. Piper Center. While we are currently gathered in this virtual space from many different parts of the world, we would like to speak to where the Piper Writers House and our Creative Writing Center reside on the Tempe campus at Arizona State University. The Piper Writer House and Arizona State University's 4 campuses are situated on the unceded ancestral lands of the Akamo Otum, Peeposh, and many other indigenous peoples. We recognize the original stewards of this land and honor those living here today, including the Gila River Indian community, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community, the Pasco Yaqui tribe, and the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation. Indigenous lives, knowledge, and stories have been rooted here long before the university came to be. They remain central to the past, present, and future of this land and to the Piper Center's current mission and literary communities. We invite you all to join us in acknowledging this land and history and in understanding that acknowledgement is simply not enough. Wherever you are joining us from, we hope that you will learn about the Indigenous peoples who came before you, about present-day Native American communities and lands, and ways that you can support their goals, rights, and culture in your own communities. With that said, I would also like to welcome our incredible speaker for this afternoon. I'm going to give a brief introduction and hand it right back over to Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. For people listening, if you have questions, keep them in mind. There will be a question and answer period at the end. So, Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz is a historian, writer, and professor emeritus in ethnic studies at California State University, East Bay, and longtime social justice activist. She is author and editor of 15 books, including a literary memoir trilogy, Red Dirt, Growing Up Okie, Outlaw Woman, a memoir of the war years, 1960 to 1975, and Blood on the Border, a memoir of the Contra War. Please welcome Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz.
I think I was muted. Now I'm unmuted. Thank you, and thanks to everyone, and thanks for everyone out there who is with us today. I want to talk about settler colonialism and the founding of the United States, as well as presenting possibilities for decolonizing US history. I, like a number of historians, and particularly Native scholars and activists, have been attempting to decolonize US history for decades, which I think is a prerequisite to actually making any kind of real structural changes in our society. The first step is simply to acknowledge that the United States was founded as a settler-colonial and imperialist state at its founding. And that is the basis for every institution in the country, down to local school boards and public schools and everything. And it's something that is denied generally from politicians, liberal and even semi-radical, to conservatives, to and both parties, and everyone have a mythical origin story. It has changed a little bit over time from totally white republic, but it has kept its core definition as the shining beacon on the hill. The United States has been called a fiscal-military state, and I think that's an important technical term, a term of economics. What it means is it's a capitalist state designed for war. And it is the first capitalist republic founded in human history. And indeed, there have been very few days on this continent since 1607, when the pre-US Anglo colonies and subsequent United States has not been at war. During the first 300 years, up to 1890, mainly wars of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and genocide of indigenous nations. There was also the invasion and 2 years of killing anything that moves, war against the Mexican people, culminating in the United States annexing the northern half of Mexico and creating that disputed border. And from its founding, the United States warships roamed throughout the Caribbean, the Pacific, and North Africa, so-called gunboat diplomacy, triggering coups and annexing and occupying the Philippines following a genocidal war, as well as many of the islands of the Pacific, and dominating world economy. The starting point is to understand settler colonialism. As the late Australian anthropologist Patrick Wolfe emphasized in his groundbreaking research on settler colonialism is a structure, not a one-time event. And it's an invisible structure that can only be described and analyzed in concrete terms to understand it. But in the case of the United States, settler colonialism was somewhat different than simply a colonial structure that developed and replicated itself over time in the 170 years of British colonization in North America, preceding the founding of the United States. The founders themselves, the elite class that founded the United States and wrote the Constitution, were proud imperialists who visualized the conquest of the continent to gain access to the Pacific in order to dominate China, a longtime goal of Western Christian monarchies in Europe. An armed republic was a far greater mechanism for achieving that goal, but it required land, wealth, and full settler self-interest and participation. The elite Englishmen who founded and designed the United States devised a unique plan, manifest in the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which was created during the War of Independence by the Continental Congress and was reenacted at independence by the US Congress in 1789. The provisions of the Northwest Land Ordinance were borrowed in part from the British system of settler colonialism in Ulster, Ireland, and the 13 colonies in North America. However, the US founders created something totally new under the sun: the constitutional construction of the fiscal military state. The capitalist republic made for war that would require both ethnic cleansing of the native presence in order to have land to offer European and Euro-American settlers, along with an enslaved labor force, producing racial capitalism, which is baked into the structure of the United States economy and politics. The Northwest Ordinance provided for eventual settler self-government once European American settlers outnumbered the indigenous population. The Land Act guaranteed to the settlers property in fee simple, civil rights, religious freedom, trial by jury, representational legislation, and public education. That ultimate conclusion, however, was preceded by successive stages of colonial development, from military ethnic cleansing and control to a federally appointed territorial government to a semi-representational government to finally admission into the United States as a state. These states constituted units of the fiscal military state with a great deal of autonomy. Ethnic cleansing and attracting European and Euro-American settlers to US occupied territories could take a long time. In many cases, for instance, it took 64 years for New Mexico, after being conquered from the war in Mexico and occupied by the United States, it took 64 years to be granted statehood, only in 1916. Historian Howard Lamar observed that apologists for US expansionism do not see the ordinance as a reflection of colonialism, but rather as a means of, quote, reconciling the problem of liberty with the problem of empire. The founders were unapologetic imperialists, chips off the old block of British imperialism, but with the added conceit of an empire for liberty, as Thomas Jefferson conceived the future of the United States. Historian David Reynolds writes that Jefferson believed the US empire was destined to assume a certain responsibility to spread what its definition of freedom around the world, starting with the North American continent and intervening abroad. United States foreign policy was stamped with this concept and has provided the ideological motivation for all US wars and interventions. Through the Northwest Ordinance, the United States created a unique land system among colonial powers, including Britain. In the US system, land itself, not just what was produced from the land, such as agriculture, mining, logging, grazing, and so on, but land, real estate, was the most important exchange commodity for the accumulation of capital and building the national treasury. In order to comprehend the apparently irrational genocidal policy of the US government toward the presence of Native nations on the land, the centrality of land sales in building the economic base and wealth of the US capital system must be the frame of reference. This policy was embedded in the design of the fiscal military state. As Wolf summed it up, tribal land was tribally owned. Tribes and private property did not mix. He says jokingly, Indians were the original communist menace. Whatever settlers may say, and they generally have a lot to say, the primary motive for elimination is not race or religion, ethnicity, grade of civilization, or anything else but access to territory. Territoriality is the settler-colonialism specific, irreducible element. However, Wolf didn't quite understand the difference for the US founders between territory and land and the centrality of land as real estate. It was pretty much unique to the United States. It got copied all over the world later, mainly in the 20th century, but it was a unique system. But Wolf makes a correct point about US American obsession with private property. Regarding the communal nature of Native societies, Senator Henry Dawes, arguing in the 1880s for allotment of collectively held indigenous lands, said, the defect of the reservation system was apparent. It is socialist. Henry George's system. Henry George was a Christian socialist in the 19th century. And under socialism, there is no enterprise. Now this was in 1880, not after the Bolshevik Revolution. He's talking about socialism. And under socialism, there is no enterprise to make your home any better than that of your neighbors. There is no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization. Till this people will consent to give up their lands and divide among their citizens so that each can own the land he cultivates, they will not make much more progress. And so they did allot all of the land, and that reduced Native land base by 3/4 because the allotments were mostly given to white people, white settlers. Although private property in land has long been a fact of life in Europe, it was demarcated by the contours of streams, rivers, tree lines, rock formations, and mountains, and was reserved for the economic and political elite. The United States, being founded as a settler-colonial fiscal-military state, created something new under the sun: the Platt system of privatizing into marketable units all of the land. The Northwest Ordinance spawned the public land survey system, a unique surveying method to plat, that is, divide land, transforming it into property for sale with deeds, and moving in settlers to replace the indigenous inhabitants. These plots of 160 acres with sections of 4 plots or 640 acres. As the United States took more land with the Louisiana Purchase and ethnic cleansing, and the Oregon Territory and ethnic cleansing, and half of Mexico and ethnic cleansing, the government promised free land to Europeans and Euro-Americans for the purpose of recruiting and motivating settlers to squat on indigenous peoples' lands. With indigenous resistance to the squatters, the army would be dispatched. The pieces of paper, deeds representing units of land, made up the commodity market that built the United States capitalist system and remains its central factor today. The other main commodity until 1860 was human, the enslaved African body with its deed of sale, actually worth more by 1840 even than 160 acres of land. Historian Donald Harmon Atkinson aptly describes the implementation of the plat system. Its importance was equal to that of the trumpet-toned Constitution of 1787, that is the land ordinances. It did not deal with ethereal concepts such as the pursuit of happiness, but instead declared in practical terms how the land from the Appalachian Mountains up to the Mississippi River was to be conquered. This was to be done by surveyors' chains, each 22 yards in length. The measuring began at a point in the Ohio Territory, and invisible lines were drawn on the land to form a grid of perfect rectangles marked by cairns, iron bars, and the occasional brass plate cemented onto a masonry base. Each of the rectangles had its own map reference, and as the United States Imperium expanded, the grid eventually reached the Pacific coast and stretched between Mexico and British North America. The lines on the land not only conquered natural topography, but also made possible the liberation of parcels of land from their previous occupants and their efficient allocation to newcomers. So this was the implementation of settler colonialism and the fiscal military state, the state made by war and for war in order to appropriate property. This is US settler colonialism. From the beginning of surveys in the newly claimed Northwest Territory to the Pacific Ocean, the lands claimed by surveys were already densely populated with indigenous peoples, mostly living in villages east of the Mississippi and in the Pacific Northwest and Southwest, and as herders in the plains. But the land was treated as terra nullius, unpopulated, and while the indigenous nations and communities, reduced in numbers by genocidal warfare that caused displacement, starvation, crowded refugee situations, and resultant infectious diseases, were forced onto army-guarded reservations dependent on government rations. The indigenous peoples of the large native agricultural nations of the South were forcibly relocated to west of the Mississippi. Actually, 50 some nations are represented in Oklahoma, and there are only 5 original native nations in that territory before it was turned into Indian territory for relocation of everyone from east of the Mississippi. This is important for understanding not only how settler colonialism defines the United States and all its institutions, but also, as Mahmoud Mamdani has documented, that all of the defining institutions of settler colonialism as practiced in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries were first developed in North America. The US tribal homeland was the prototype not only for the South African Reserve under apartheid and Israeli settler colonialism of Palestine, but also the Nazi concentration camp. During the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln did not forget his free soiler base that had brought him to that high office. Free soil meant free of chattel slavery for white commercial farmers like Lincoln's family, who could not afford to purchase enslaved bodies. Congress, at Lincoln's behest, passed the Homestead Act in 1862, at the height of the Civil War, that legislation that just simply took away, without treaties, took away native land, as well as the Morrill Act, the latter transferring large tracts of indigenous land to the states to establish land-grant universities, which I believe includes Arizona State University. The Pacific Railroad Act provided private companies with nearly 200 million acres of indigenous land. With these massive land grabs, the US government broke multiple treaties with indigenous nations whose people were still living there. It would take genocidal military force to evict them. Most of the Western territories, including Colorado, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, were delayed in achieving statehood because indigenous nations resisted appropriation of their lands and outnumbered the settlers until they didn't. So the colonialization plan for the West, established during the Civil War, was carried out over the following 3 decades of war and land grabs. Under the Homestead Act, 1.5 million homesteads were granted to settlers west of the Mississippi, comprising nearly 300 million acres, a half million square miles, taken from indigenous collective estates and privatized for the market. The dispersal of landless settler populations from east of the Mississippi served as an escape valve for the ruling class, lessening the likelihood of class conflict as the Industrial Revolution accelerated the use of cheap immigrant labor. Little of the land appropriated under the Homestead Act was distributed to actual single-family homesteaders. It was passed instead to large operators or land speculators. The land laws appeared to have been created for that result, because an individual could acquire 1,120 or more acres of land, even though homestead and preemption, that is legalized squatting, claims were limited to 160 acres. But a claimant could obtain a homestead and secure the title after 5 years or pay cash within 6 months. Then he could acquire another 160 acres under preemption, that is squatting, by living on another piece of land for 6 months and paying $1.25 per acre. While acquiring these titles, he could also be fulfilling requirements for a timber culture claim of 160 acres and a desert land claim of 640 acres, neither of which required occupancy for title. Other men within the family or other partners in enterprise could take out additional desert land claims to increase their holdings even more. As industrialization quickened, land as a commodity, real estate, remained the basis of the US economy and capitalist accumulation. The federal land grants to the railroad barons carved out of indigenous territories were not limited to the width of the railroad tracks, but rather formed a checkerboard of square mile sections stretching for hundreds of miles on both sides of the right-of-way. This was land the railroads, private companies, were free to sell to settlers in parcels for their own profit. The 1863-1864 Federal Banking Acts mandated a national currency, chartered banks, and permitted the government to guarantee bonds. As war profiteers, financiers, and industrialists such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan used these laws to amass wealth in the East. Leland Stanford, Colin Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker in the West grew rich from building railroads with cheap Chinese and Irish labor and Eastern capital on land granted by the United States government. So the history of the United States is a history of settler colonialism. Very few historians trained in US history take up these facts and put a kind of sheen over it as the land acts being creating wealth for small farmers, letting them become independent and private and not workers. But that's simply not how it really worked. So settler colonialism's goal was to terminate indigenous peoples as nations and communities with land bases in order to make the land available to European settlers. Extermination and assimilation are the methods used. And this is the very definition of genocide in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. US history, as well as inherited indigenous trauma and that of descendants of enslaved Africans, cannot be understood and accounted for without acknowledging the genocide that the United States committed against Native nations and enslaved Africans, both of whose descendants survive in US claimed boundaries under conditions that can constitute continued cultural genocide and social genocide. From the colonial period through the founding of the United States and continuing into the 20th century, this has entailed torture, terror, sexual abuse, and rape, massacres, systematic military occupations, removals of indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories, forced removal of Native American children to military-like boarding schools over a period of a century. Children stripped of languages and cultures, as well as allotment of land, the privatization of indigenous territories, and from 1953 to 1974, congressionally legislated policy, the Indian Termination Act. That's what it was called. It took 20 years for the Red Power movement to reverse termination, with a great deal of damage being done in that time. Within the logic of settler colonialism, genocide was the inherent overall policy of the United States from its founding. But there are also specific documented policies of genocide on the part of US administrations that can be identified in at least 5 distinct periods. The first is the Revolutionary War itself through 1832 in the Ohio country. And the Ohio country is not just the size of the state of Ohio, but included Illinois, Iowa, Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, that whole area on the other side of the Appalachian up to the plains. The second is the 1830s Jacksonian era of forced removals to Indian territory, establishment of Indian territory. And the third, the 1850s California Gold Rush era in North America, which a very important book by historian Benjamin Madley documents, just came out a few years ago. And for the Civil War and post-Civil War era up to 1890, the so-called Indian Wars west of the Mississippi. And 5, the 1950s termination and relocation period. Additionally, there were genocidal policies and practices that overlapped those time periods, in particular, the compulsory federal boarding schools from the 1870s to the 1960s. The Carlisle boarding school, founded by US Army officer Richard Henry Pratt in 1879, became a model for others established by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They also gave contracts to various religious, to the Episcopals, Presbyterians, Baptists, and so forth, to form recognized boarding schools. This became the model. The Carlisle boarding school became the model for all of those established by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Pratt said in a speech in 1892, quote, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. In a sense, I agree with that sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." But that is exactly the definition of genocide. It doesn't have to be killing the person. It's making it impossible for a group to remain cohesive as a group. Cases of genocide carried out as policy may be found in historical documents as well as in the oral histories of indigenous communities. An example from 1873 is typical, with General William T. Sherman, hero of the Civil War, writing, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. During an assault, the soldiers cannot pause to distinguish between male and female or even discriminate as to age." Although Sherman demurred that the US did not desire to totally destroy the natives, it would be necessary if they did not comply and give up. The nearly 3 centuries long Indian Wars technically ended around 1880, although the Wounded Knee Massacre of some 300 starving Lakota Sioux refugees occurred a decade later. Clearly an act with genocidal intent, the Wounded Knee Massacre is still officially listed as a victorious battle in the annals of the US military. Congressional Medals of Honor were bestowed on 20 of the soldiers involved. A monument was built at Fort Riley, Kansas, to honor the soldiers killed by friendly fire. A battle streamer was created to honor the event and added to other streamers that are displayed at the Pentagon, West Point, and Army bases throughout the world. And none of that has changed to this day. The old Northwest Territory was the initial site of genocidal policy enacted by the founders of the United States. By the time of the War of Independence that created the United States, British settlers and armed white militias had 170 years experience in ethnically cleansing and dominating the 13 original colonies. Employing this intergenerationally practiced and unlimited war against civilians and their resources, the government and settlers intensified and accelerated those practices from 1787 to 1832 in the invasion and conquest of the Ohio country, the Northwest Territory, which comprised the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. The genocidal campaigns carried out by the new US Army were resisted by a confederation of indigenous nations, by various confederations of indigenous nations. But by 1803, ethnically cleansed Ohio became a state, followed by Indiana 13 years later, and others following. In the next period of the United States, the Army under Andrew Jackson pursued genocidal wars in the South against the Muskogees and Cherokees and into Spanish Florida, where the US Marines and Army mounted 3 major wars against the Seminole Nation between 1816 and 1858, the longest war in US history, albeit without succeeding in removing the Seminole people completely. And when Jackson was president in the 1830s, he ordered and the Army carried out the forced removal of all the Native people from east of the Mississippi. During the Civil War, the Union Army forced the removal and 4-year incarceration of the Dene, resulting in the death of half their population. During the same time, the Dakota Nation was forced by the Union Army out of their homeland in Minnesota, while unarmed Northern Cheyenne were massacred in their reservation at Sand Creek in Colorado. After the Civil War, 6 of the 7 divisions of the US Army were stationed west of the Mississippi, where they carried out genocidal wars against the Plains and Southwestern indigenous nations, including the intentional extermination of tens of millions of bison. These troops were pulled out of the South, where they were supposed to be occupying the defeated former Confederate states to allow for land distribution to former slaves and for their political participation in democratic elections. Without sufficient US Army troops to stop them, the Ku Klux Klan made Reconstruction impossible, imposed a reign of terror, and restored the ex-Confederate elite, the Jim Crow era that was dismantled only in the 1960s, thanks to the Civil Rights Revolution. But the Wild West, so-called, originated in the Northwest Territory, east of the Mississippi, not in the West. Defining the West as the site of genocidal conquest erases its origins at the very founding of the United States, when and where its leaders were intent on building world power based on land theft, genocide, and slavery, the pillars of US settler colonialism. It is essential to understand that aggressive white nationalism and settler colonialism form the bedrock of US institutions and historical and continuing white nationalism, a culture of violence, a gun culture, a militaristic culture, and that genocidal policy toward indigenous nations and descendants of enslaved Africans always looms inside the United States and has been extended globally by genocidal US policies and wars in the Pacific and the Caribbean, including Central America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and increasingly in Africa. Decolonizing US history provides a roadmap for a new generation to decolonize the United States itself. That has to begin with the demilitarization of the United States and the restoration of all land taken from Native nations outside of authentic treaty agreements, practically all land now administered under the Department of the Interior, including national parks and forests. I'll stop there, and I hope you have, I've said enough that you have some questions or comments. Comments are fine. You don't have to ask me a question if you don't wish to.
So if anyone wants to add questions into the chat or raise their hands, we'll do our best to follow up and unmute people as we go, or read the questions off from the chat.
You could also ask them to turn off their audio, right? I mean, their mute.
If anyone does have a question, they can raise their hand and we'll unmute you. You can't unmute yourself, but we're happy to do it for you to ask a question. so far in your chat, it's a lot of thanking you for being here and this being amazing. It really has been. Thank you so much.
Don't everyone talk at once. Do you want me to go on talking and talking?
I think so. We're getting a couple here, just from the Q&A. How do you insert an influx of Asian Americans into this construct? Maybe within decolonization.
That's a really good question. In my new book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler-Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Exclusion and Erasure, I think the longest chapter is on Asian, let's call yellow peril, and fear of Asians and discrimination based on Chinese, basically. This goes back to, I did not know this until I was researching the new book, how far back it goes into the Middle Ages, you know, the Marco Polo, 27 years, the Italian who was sent to scope out what China was about and coming back with horror stories of how organized these people were. And they produce all these amazing things, you know, like silk items and China, you know, fantastic works of household, you know, dishes and plates that were desired in Europe, because Europe didn't make anything. They didn't produce anything that anyone wanted. So an uneven trade developed, but this fear that this very organized mass of people would come to try to dominate the world. So this paranoia goes so far back in Western so-called civilization that I was not aware of, and it was just inherent. You know, the founders of the United States talked about it, you know, how they had to get to China and dominate Chinese trade. And by 1840, in fact, they had made China into they forced the Opium Wars, forced opium on them. They had made it into, you know, the poorest place in the world, with people leaving in droves because they were starving. And that's so-called, you know, Chinese immigration, not just, you know, all over to South America, anywhere, just to find jobs, some kind of income and way to help their families back home as well, or bring them out. And so it wasn't until 1948 that China began, you know, founded, really decolonized, and started building back, you might say. I don't, and this fear has never abated. You know, there's warships surrounding China. I haven't seen any on our shores of Chinese warships or planes buzzing over, you know, the South China Sea. But this is the situation. This is the context in which there's discrimination against, especially Chinese. I live in San Francisco, where half the population is Chinese. So my neighbors, you know, and I am very well aware, even in this place, they certainly don't dominate economics or politics here. Numbers, you know, only, and a very large working class, and also shops. The abuse, verbal and physical, that has come out, you know, Trump's Wuhan flu refrain, and the kind of trigger happy US Americans who always like to find someone to hate, really became a focus, and of course led to the mass shooting of what, you know, what were really Korean but Asian women, sex workers in Atlanta. great tragedy. So there's this other thing that Chickasaw scholar Jody Burden, I highly recommend her book, Transit of Empire. It's just, I think it's the most important book to read to understand the United States. And I use it profusely in all my work. It came out in time for me to use for Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. And so I think it was published in 2012, but it is really an important and brilliant book. And she suggests that a part of the discrimination against Chinese and Asians in the United States is based on Indian hating. Because there's this written in stone, highly questionable theory called the Bering Straits theory, where all of the people of who came to North America became, Native Americans, American Indians, were that they all poured in and went all the way down to the Antarctica. It's an unlikely way of people peopling the earth in other places to just pour in one funnel place and fill two continents that stretch from the Arctic to the Antarctic. So of course there were, they had boats, people in the Pacific had boats and they moved across, and we know that Polynesians, of course, came to North America and back and forth. So Europe has always made everything else in the world static except Europe, and they're great. When they started out to sea, the Muslims had already been at it for 5 centuries before the Europeans did. So that's very interesting. That hadn't occurred to me before, but this linkage of, and of course, Native Americans, many, and especially in North America, can be mistaken. I was married to an Acoma man who lived here in San Francisco with me in the 1970s, and he kept getting Chinese people would come up and start talking to him in Chinese, and he loved it. He loved the Chinese, he still does. He loves the Chinese people. So it wasn't an insult. He didn't feel insulted at all, but it was the first time I realized, I hadn't made the connection that there was that sense of familiarity. And so that, could very well be because Native Americans were the enemy of mankind for the settlers in the United States. That was their designation. I get that from John Trudell. He says he sorted out as a poet, different slots that people were in the United States, and he says, and us Indians, we're the enemy. We were the enemy. So this then gets transferred. A sort of Indian hating is not as cool as it used to be. A lot has Native people have been able to turn that around to a very great extent. It's not as it's still, in border towns in South Dakota and Gallup and places, it's still rapid racism against Native people. But in general, in the society, it's waned somewhat. And of course, there's a very large number of Chinese Americans, and so this fear and hatred may very well be both, grounded in that European mistrust and hatred that goes way back. And remember, the settlers were all European, and British, but also Germans and especially Germans. And but Indian hating, you know, that it's been transferred or carried on, and not much. There's not much cultural push. There's more during the pandemic, and especially after the slaughter of the women in Atlanta. There was at least a moment of thinking about, you know, this is leading to real violence. And still out here, you know, in Oakland and San Francisco, young Asians in the community walk around with the elders. They were especially attacking elderly women, just knocking them over. It's very easy for a large man to just, you know, put the hand on the back of any elderly person. But Chinese women, you know, are smaller in stature, and simply knock them down. And a couple were actually killed in that way. And so they still have their citizens patrols, you know, accompanying elderly people around, you know, when they're out shopping or whatever. So it's, I think there is a relationship. Thank you for that question.
I want to make sure that there's so many amazing questions that are coming in, so I'm going to try to conjoin a few if that's okay. There's a question about what are the resources that you utilize for your type of research, and if I can piggyback that into an additional question. How do we, as so-called regular people, assist in decolonizing U.S. history as teachers, or if you're not teachers yourselves? Is that a matter of advocacy in school boards, at national curriculum orientation, or speaking to the federal governments as it's tied to federal education? Just a few overall questions on, in conversation with your talk on the fiscal military state, how do we as citizens work against it and be able to leverage this history in decolonizing?
Good. Yeah, as for my sources and research, my grounding, I did my master's degree, and I did my BA degree in history, focusing on European imperialism, European history that brought about imperialism. But I'm not very good with languages, so I sort of, you know, for graduate school, I continued that, but I sort of tended then toward, you know, I really did not want to do US history per se. So I transferred from UC Berkeley to UCLA. They used to have kind of divide up what they specialized in, less so now, but UCLA specialized in area studies. So I was most interested in the Southwest, what had formerly been Spanish, colonized by the Spanish, and became Mexico and then taken from the United States. So I kind of did this hybrid US Latin American history, Mexican history. But I had to take a seminar in all of Latin American history. And that's where I really learned about imperialism, US imperialism, because I wasn't emphasizing that. I was looking at European imperialism. And looking up from Latin America to the United States, you see imperialism written everywhere. Gunboat diplomacy, occupation, 35 years occupying Nicaragua, of course, annexing Puerto Rico, which is still a colony, and Dominican Republic and Cuba. So then I did my doctorate on the history of land tenure in northern New Mexico, from prehistoric times to the present. So I wasn't doing, well, no one was. This is, there were ethnic studies was beginning to be developed, Native studies, but I wasn't thinking I was doing Native studies, although the first part of that book is almost completely on the Pueblos of New Mexico, the Hopi and the Dene and Apaches, of course, because that was their country before the Spanish came, and then the Spanish period, and then the U.S. Takeover of half of Mexico, and then and then the 19th century, and then the 20th century. So I had just gotten my doctorate with that dissertation when Wounded Knee happened. And right after Wounded Knee, there were 1,000 Native people arrested, for various crimes and misdemeanors, felonies and misdemeanors. And it got kind of whittled down. Only a few, the leadership had trials. And what was left was, by the time I was recruited to the Wounded Knee Legal Defense, it was down to 300 and some people left, that they decided. Vine Deloria Jr., who's a lawyer, Dakota, and a lawyer, was leading this, along with many other lawyers, were leading this push to dismiss all of these three. So they got a case in court. The Great Sioux Nation, basically against the U.S. government, in federal court, Lincoln, Nebraska. So he was kind of recruiting people to be expert witnesses. And so I knew one of the lawyers working, John Thorne, a white lawyer in San Jose. He had helped me get my FBI files, and I got to know him. And he was working on that. So he suggested me. He knew, about my dissertation. And so Vine Deloria, recruited me, and he came and talked to me, and I said, I'm not the right person because I do the Southwest. I don't know anything about the Lakota, Dakota, or any Indians anywhere other than, I grew up in Oklahoma. I know there, but that had nothing to do with anything I knew. And so he just handed me an armload of papers, documents, and said, I'm sure you're a fast learner. And so indeed, I got to work and learned a lot in a short time. But what I learned, it was a 2-week trial, and it was in this tiny little federal courthouse in Lincoln, Nebraska. And the entire Lakota Nation, I swear, at least those who were involved in the Wounded Knee, which was the majority, came down and set up camp on the Missouri River, the teepees all along the Missouri River. So every evening, all of us, expert witnesses and the lawyers, would go down. There'd be a big bonfire. They would feed us, and then everyone would gather. And they did have some kind of loud, sort of loudspeaker system. And it was cold as hell. It was like December in Lincoln, Nebraska. It was freezing cold. Of course, the Lakota, Dakota are used to this. And my California, I was not used to it. But they would then tell the lawyers what they wanted the next day to look like and what witnesses they wanted on. And they were teaching these lawyers. You know, Vine Deloria was really the only Lakota Dakota lawyer involved. There weren't that many Native lawyers at that time. And so it was a teaching process. So my basic learning was oral, literally oral history. And once you learn a kind of platform for learning, I mean, every tribe is different. And I knew that, you know, and I knew Oklahoma was like 50 different tribes there, each very, very different. But on the other hand, I didn't understand much when I was growing up. And it gives you the tools, you know, the understanding and the importance of oral history. That was the real thing, the importance of what they were testifying these elders to was their history of the treaty. And they were basing this on the 1868 Sioux United States Treaty. They didn't win the case, but it was a phenomenal, you know, it went to the Supreme Court and they didn't win the case, and some of the people were tried and some of them were dismissed, but it was an incredible event. And so I started going to these large gatherings, you know, and like up in Northern California with the Pitt River people were fighting to get federal acknowledgement, working with them, going with Shoshones and in Nevada and just listening. So my basis, other than the Southwest, which I had researched in a traditional way from the archives, and they have all the Spanish archives in Santa Fe, so I didn't have to go to Spain. But other than that, it was learning orally, and so that was, you know, I think that's why it's really important. There's Native American studies and Native Americans teaching it, because you're really you're getting the research, but you're also getting the oral history, because that person is themselves an encyclopedia of oral history, that Native person. So I know that was a long way to say it, but it's really important to take Native American studies classes. They're almost everywhere now, and they're really, really important. And there are a lot of good books now too, Native scholars books like Jody Bird's and many others and also novels, you know, and poetry. There's a lot available now. As for decolonizing US history, I would, like I said, I think first it takes the acknowledgement of what it is. That I think I feel, even myself, I've been an activist ever since I came of age in the 60s, and of course in the anti-war movement, the women's movement, and also I've been an activist as well as a scholar, and I consider history as a part of my activism of decolonizing history, that it's an activist pursuit. And I think we have to look at it that way, but that it's a real thing. It's not just, ideas, that it is it's material with settler colonialism, you know, of having to, I tried to give this, you know, this kind of deep understanding of how it works. It's not like regular colonialism where you can throw out, I mean, you have a lot of trauma from centuries of colonialism, but you throw it off and have an independent state and try to build from that, you know, and to recover some things from the past, returning to the source and understanding and trying to decolonize yourself. But in a settler colonial state, the colonized have been reduced to a tiny minority. That's the point of settler colonialism. So it's very hard to recover that history. You know, it's not mean-spirited on the part of most white people, settlers, and especially immigrants. It's just that they don't know. They don't know where to start. So that's why I wrote an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States as a starter. You know, one Native friend calls it the one-stop shopping book. And it is kind of that, you know, it's this overview that then you can say, aha, and, you know, it defines what settler colonialism and goes on. And there are many other books that have come out since then that are equally, and a whole journal called Settler Colonialism now that's published out of Canada and has a lot of US in it too. So I think we probably run out of time, haven't we?
We are running out of time. My apologies to folks that we didn't get to your questions. I had this one last question, if we could end on it, Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz, if that's okay.
Sure.
Could you expand on the historic pervasiveness of what is now called vigilante violence and white supremacy and the approval of white supremacy, especially in the context of news today?
Yeah. Yeah, for those who don't know, the baby killer, baby-faced killer in Kenosha was exonerated completely. That's white nationalism, you know, being reinforced, and a whole new definition of what is self-defense. So white nationalism is mainly descendants of the original settlers. And, you know, some who are from immigrant backgrounds. I date the beginning of immigration with, you know, the 1870s, of massive immigration to the northeastern industrial sector. Everyone who came before then were settlers. And so immigrants come to something that's already completely formed. You know, they came, the whole United States was taken. They didn't know anything about that history. They came from Italy, they came from Russia, they came from being pogroms, Jewish people, and with their own histories, but knowing nothing about what happened before and having to adjust to it and be discriminated against. So the original settlers are outnumbered now, and they're quite anxious about it, that they call it white genocide. And they think they're in a real war, you know, not just a culture war, not a symbolic war, but a real war to stop immigration and to literally, you know, they don't really recognize anyone who's a child of immigrants, who's not a descendant from a settler, as real Americans, as, you know, as full Americans. And they never will be, because they didn't come as settlers. And so that's the mindset. And I grew up in rural Oklahoma, and my father's family, Scots-Irish, were, you know, the greatest number of these. They're the people who colonized Ulster and Ireland, the Scots who went and took Irish land, pushed the Irish out, made them tenant farmers and all, and took their land. And that's still a problem today. It's 50, they only got 50%. They couldn't absolutely ethnically cleanse it, but it's still a, you know, a simmering war all the time in Ulster, Ireland. So that's settler colonialism, apartheid government, you know, I named it in South Africa, Israel and the Palestinians. That's a settler colonial situation. So so it's alive and well, but it's you know, it's like people who immigrate to Israel don't always, you know, like the Ethiopians or whatever, Ethiopian Jews, they don't know what they're getting into. It's an already set thing that they have to adjust to, or they're not accepted. But white nationalists never accept, you know, and only a few I can kind of trace the names, of these people, and it's a treasure trove, the lists of those hundreds who were in the January 6th. I've tried to profile several of them, just to see their backgrounds, and can usually assess whether they're descendants of the original settlers. And I am, my father's side, with the Dunbars, Scots-Irish from Appalachia, and then moving over to Missouri and then to Oklahoma, and all over the place. They're everywhere, scattered everywhere. So that is a problem. I tried to tell people for many, many years, this is a problem. These people are, because they were already, when the civil rights movement started and really, really became effective in the 1950s, they had already formed the John Birch Society and armed Minutemen, and then in the 1980s, there were all kinds of armed militias. So this isn't new. This has been, they've been anti-multiculturalism, anti-immigrant. And now, it's the first time they had Reagan for 8 years, but Reagan was not nearly as powerful and successful as Donald Trump in giving them lasting, even if he never takes power again, he's empowered them. And they, I don't think they're going to reverse that easily. And I don't think, because most people in the US do not understand settler colonialism. They don't understand where these people are coming from. They call them racist, but yeah, they're racist, but they're white supremacists. They're white nationalists. And that's a better understanding of who they are than simply racism. It's much more than that. They don't like any immigrants except Germans and English, and so even Russians to them are who are not people of color. So you can't call it racism. It's white nationalism. It's far more dangerous actually than simple racism, which we have some tools to deal with now. But I think people are kind of blindsided by this, like what's going on with these people and how could they possibly take the Capitol over, and elect a president and maintain his, and take the whole Republican Party. So it's a serious situation we're in.
Dr. Dunbar-Ortiz, we so appreciate your insight and your talk today. And thank you very much. Congratulations on your newest book. We look forward to more. And thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I will close out the meeting, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you.